It was a cold, foggy evening in the small town of Ravenswood. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the distant ticking of the old clock tower. Detective Arthur Lane sat in his dimly lit office, sipping on a cup of black coffee. He was known as the best detective in town, the man who could solve any mystery. But tonight, he was about to face a case that would test his skills like never before. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," said Detective Lane, setting his cup down. The door creaked open, and a young woman stepped inside. She was dressed in a long black coat, her face pale and her eyes filled with fear. "Detective Lane, I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, sit down," said Lane, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What's the matter?" The woman sat down and took a deep breath. "My name is Claire Bennett. My husband, Richard Bennett, was found dead this morning. The police say it was suicide, but I know he would never do such a thing. He was murdered." Detective Lane leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Tell me everything." Clara explained that her husband was a successful businessman. He had no enemies, no debts, and no reason to take his own life. The night before his death, he had attended a secret meeting at the old Ravenswood Manor. He had told Clara it was important, but didn't give any details. When he returned home, he seemed nervous and refused to talk about what had happened. The next morning, he was found dead in his study, a gun in his hand and a single bullet wound to his head. "The police didn't find any evidence of foul play," said Clara. "But I know something is wrong. Please, Detective, you have to find out the truth." Detective Lane agreed to take the case. He visited the Bennett house and examined the study. Everything normal, but one thing caught his attention. On the desk, there was a piece of paper with a single word written on it: silence. Lane frowned. What did it mean? He decided to investigate the secret meeting at Ravenswood Manor. The manor was an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was said to be haunted, and no one had lived there for years. When Lane arrived, he found the door unlocked. Inside, the air was cold, and the walls were covered in dust. In the main hall, he found a table with 5 chairs. On the table, there were 5 glasses and a bottle of wine. It was clear that a meeting had taken place. But who were the people involved? Lane searched the room and found a small notebook hidden under one of the chairs. It belonged to Richard Bennett. The notebook contained a list of names: Richard Bennett, Edward Blackwood, Margaret Hayes, Victor Langston, Eleanor Graves. Detective Lane recognized some of the names. Edward Blackwood was a wealthy banker, Margaret Hayes, a famous artist, Victor Langston, a retired judge, and Eleanor Graves, a well-known journalist. What were these people doing together in an abandoned manor? Lane decided to visit each of them. His first stop was Edward Blackwood's mansion. Blackwood was a tall, stern man with a sharp gaze. When Lane asked about the meeting, Blackwood denied everything. "I don't know what you're talking about," said Blackwood. "I've never been to Ravenswood Manor." But Lane noticed something strange. Blackwood's hands were trembling, and there was a faint smell of wine on his breath. Next, Lane visited Margaret Hayes. She was a beautiful woman with a mysterious aura. When Lane mentioned the meeting, she became nervous. I don't remember anything," she said, avoiding his eyes. Lane's third visit was to Victor Langston. The retired judge was an old man with a kind face, but when Lane brought up the meeting, Langston's expression turned grim. "Some secrets are better left buried," he said. "I suggest you drop this case, Detective." Finally, Lane went to see Eleanor Graves. She was a bold and confident woman, but even she seemed uneasy when Lane mentioned Ravenswood Manor. "I can't help you," she said. "I have nothing to say." Detective Lane was frustrated. All four of them were hiding something, but he couldn't figure out what. That night, Lane returned to his office and reviewed the evidence. The word silence on the desk, the 5 glasses at the manor, the list of names, and the strange behavior of the 4 individuals. What connected them all? Suddenly, it hit him. The silent speaker. Lane remembered an old legend about a secret society called the Silent Speakers. They were a group of powerful people who met in secret to make decisions that affected the town. No one knew who they were, and no one dared to speak about them. Could Richard Bennett and the others have been part of this society? And if so, why was Bennett killed? Lane decided to confront Edward Blackwood again. This time, he was more direct. "I know about the Silent Speakers," said Lane. "And I know you're one of them." Blackwood's face turned pale. "You don't understand," he said. "If you dig too deep, you'll put yourself in danger." "I'm not afraid," said Lane. "Tell me the truth." Blackwood hesitated, then finally spoke. "Richard Bennett wanted to expose the society. He thought what we were doing was wrong. The others, they couldn't let that happen." "So they killed him?" asked Lane. Blackwood nodded. "It was supposed to look like a suicide, but I didn't want any part of it. That's why I've been so nervous." Detective Lane now had the answers he needed. The Silent Speakers were real, and they had killed Richard Bennett to protect their secrets. The next day, Lane gathered all the evidence and went to the police. But when he arrived at the station, he was told that the case had been closed. "There's no evidence of murder," said the chief. "It was a suicide, plain and simple." Lane knew the truth, but without proof, there was nothing he could do. The Silent Speakers had won. As he walked back to his office, Lane couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The town of Ravenswood was full of secrets, and some of them were better left unsolved. But Detective Arthur Lane was not a man who gave up easily. He knew that one day the truth would come to light, and when it did, he would be ready.